Right, people, I'm going to show you how to take your footage from this to this within minutes. It is really, really easy. You just need to understand what's going on with your camera in order to do so. So what people do is they buy the newest camera on the market and they just press record and they leave the camera in auto and they think it's going to solve all their problems. It does to a certain extent because obviously it's a new piece of glass, but the computers inside are basically going to play around with these 3 settings that every camera has that we're going to manually use, and I'm going to teach you how to use, but it just does it on its own and just puts them into these stupid settings that just doesn't look that great because it's trying to make sure everything's in focus, everything's as bright as it could be, and it's all in the right place. It just doesn't look that great. It ends up looking like this, and you don't want your footage looking like that. You want it to look like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the camera and we're going to change that from auto to manual, and we're going to actually control the settings, right? So you might get a little bit scared. It's not that confusing. I'm going to teach you the 3 things that you can now control on your camera to change the footage, and you will now be a professional. So turn on your camera. I use the Osmo Action 4, which is the best camera right now. I'm not being paid to say this, so you can trust my word. It is the best camera for motorbikes. I use cameras for my job. This is the best one, which is why I've got it. It's all links below. So the first thing you need to do is find where your settings are, where you can actually change the camera settings. So for me, it is on the right-hand side here, and I can press it for Pro, which is manual, or I can press Auto, which lets the camera do what it wants, which is why it's now really bright around this room. So find where you can do that, switch it into manual. The first thing you're going to have to decide is what you want to shoot in frame rate-wise, which is basically how many frames the camera is receiving. So you can either go 24 frames per second, or 60 frames per second, or 120 frames per second if you've got a camera that can do that. And basically what that is how many frames are being received by the camera. So 24 frames per second is a lower number, so there's less frames being received by the camera, so that means less things are going to be in focus, and it's going to be a little bit more slower, which is what I use because that's how you get that motion blur, because it's moving slower, which means it can't register everything as quickly and keep everything as sharp, right? So that's the one I use. You can go 60 frames per second. The best way to try this is on your iPhone or whatever phone you've got. You can normally change the frame rates. So this is 24 frames per second on the phone. As you can see, there's a bit of motion, but this is 60 frames per second. So obviously that's a little bit of a higher number, which means it's receiving more frames, so more things are in focus, it's more responsive, okay? So lower the number, less is in focus, less responsive. Higher the number, more responsive, everything's a bit sharper, less motion blur. You got that? Nice one. So I recommend going 24 frames per second for motorbikes because I like that cinematic look. But if you do move your head around a lot and you're doing a lot of talking at events and stuff, it can get a bit annoying sometimes where there's too much motion. So it just depends on what you're shooting. But for me, I'm 24 frames per second. That was easy enough. Next thing you can control is your shutter speed. So what we want to do, the rule is with cameras, is whatever your frame rate is, so 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, you have to double your shutter speed. Okay, so I'm at 24 frames per second. So on this camera, my shutter speed has to be 1/50th in order to get the smoothest synced up footage. You can go higher, you can break the rule, and you can move the shutter speed even higher if you wanted to, because obviously it's going to be really, really bright now because that shutter is moving at 1/50th, which is the slowest it can possibly go before it starts to get too like laggy basically. So it's going to be moving really, really slow and receiving information a lot slower. And obviously because that shutter's moving slower, more light is going to get into the camera because that shutter is taking less time to open and close, so more light can just constantly get in. So you're not even going to be able to see the footage. This is what it will look like if you just leave the footage in those settings, which is obviously a bit stupid, right? So what we do is we get these things over here, which are called ND filters. So basically these are sunglasses for your camera. So when it is in that bright setting, because it's such a slow shutter and so much light's getting in, you just put one of these on the end. They've got different strengths. So for normal day-to-day use, I use a 32 strength ND on the end of mine. That sorts the footage right out. I can stay locked in at those settings, 24 frames per second at 1/50th, and I can still see what's going on. Obviously, if you don't have ND filters, you can basically break the shutter speed rule of keeping it at 1/50th, and you can just raise that shutter speed so it's moving faster, but it's just then going to reduce the blur. You're going to not have that blur anymore because you're now speeding it up, so it's receiving it a little bit quicker. All right, so I do recommend getting ND filters, but it is possible without it. You just have to raise your shutter speed, so you're going to lose the motion blur. So for the most, you have to have these in order to keep those settings completely locked in where you want to. Obviously, if you're at 60 frames per second, you then have to put your shutter speed at 1/20th. Is that it? 1/100. How do you even say that? 1/120. That is what you have to have your shutter speed at for 60 frames per second, and the same for 120 frames per second. You need to be at like 240 or something like that. That's the rules with cameras, okay? So that should be fairly easy. You've chosen 24 frames per second and you've put your shutter speed at 1/50th. Everything's really bright, you've got an ND filter, you've put it on the end. From there, your ISO is the last thing that you can adjust on your camera that is going to affect your footage. So basically, again, we can use the phone to try this. You get your brightness on your phone and you lift up the brightness, and that digitally brightens up your phone. That's exactly what you can do on your camera now. So you can digitally bright up your image on your camera with this ISO. But what that does is it starts to add grain. So the more ISO you add, the grainier and noisier is what we call it noise. It starts to add all that into the image and you start to lose a bit of quality. So as you can see in this footage here, this is daytime, but the camera was in auto, and you can see all that fuzziness, that graininess. It looks a bit weird compared to normal. It's because the camera's in auto and it's at like 3000 ISO. It's trying to push that, it's trying to do too much basically, and it's trying to overcompensate all that extra light that needs brightening up. And then you therefore get that grain because it's fake. Obviously this is great for when you go inside, because they're like in this dark room right now, if I was at those settings that we just spoke about, you wouldn't really be able to see much. This is what my room would look like. But if I put the camera into auto, it's going to raise that shutter speed up to like 5000, and then you're going to be able to see around this room now because obviously the ISO has been raised. So what we want to do is in our settings, find where your ISO is. You can either manually just set a set number. So I would go around maybe 400 might be all right. But you realistically want to keep it as low as possible. So 100 is where you kind of want to keep it. But sometimes you go into dark areas. Maybe you go through a tunnel. Maybe you walk into a dealership. Maybe it starts to get a little bit dark in the evening as you're coming home. Well, your settings are not going to change. They're stuck at the settings that we chose. So you're not going to brighten up that footage. It's going to stay where it is. That's the only issue with manual mode. But what we can do on certain cameras, especially my one, you can go to the ISO, but you can actually choose a range that it is allowed to use. So you can tell it, right, keep it at 100 ISO, but when it starts to get dark, you can go no higher than 800 or no higher than 1000, right? So I would recommend setting it to 100 and then allow it to go up to 1600 or 2000 at the max, right? That's going to give you enough brightness when you go inside a room that it's going to use to brighten up that place. But then when you go back outside, it will lower it right down for you. You do have to be mindful of when you're actually using these settings, because if you go out at night with 1/50th, 24 frames per second and an ND filter on and no ISO, you're not going to be able to see. So for nighttime, I do leave the camera in auto because it's just too much to figure out, and the camera does all right at night. But in the daytime, I keep it in manual, but just be mindful of that ISO setting. That is the 3 things you can do to change your footage. Like, that is it. Choose your frame rate, 24 frames per second, more motion, 60 frames per second, it's more responsive. And you need to double your shutter speed, so 24 frames per second, you need to be at 1/50th, 60 frames per second, you need to be at 1/20th, right? And then you're just gonna make sure your ISO is set to the lowest point, you've got an ND filter on the end so you can actually see the footage, and then if you've got an ISO range, then at least put it to a maximum of like 2000 that it can go to if you go inside. That's all there is to it, right? It's really not that bad. You can get your head around it and you can transform. I used to use Insta360 One RS. I used to leave that thing in auto because I didn't have ND filters on it. If I changed that camera, I would get cinematic footage like this here that this guy uses in the canyons. He uses that same camera, but that looks way more expensive because he's got it in those certain settings and he's got an ND filter on the end. You can make an old camera look really good by putting it into manual mode. You don't always need to upgrade to the fanciest stuff. Couple of other last little tips I can give you in terms of footage is stabilization, especially for motorbike content. I would keep it all the way to the lowest setting. Don't turn it completely off. I did say this before, but I've actually gone back on my word now. I would just put it on the lowest setting so there's a little bit of stabilization. Because if you put too much on, it crops in your footage because it's trying to keep it all stable, but then also you just get these unrealistic head movements, like you look right and left and then it sort of slows down the footage and tries to smoothly bring it over. And by the time you've already done that, you're looking in a different place and it just looks stupid. It looks like a slideshow is being like pasted across. So I turn it to the lowest stabilization mode. Don't get me wrong, you feel some more bumps, but it actually does look more realistic because you feel the bumps, you see all the crazy movements. I'm looking left and right, the camera's going left and right. It's not trying to keep it too stable, but it's got enough. So when I am just riding, it is watchable. It just makes for a cooler experience. I do really think that the lowest stabilization mode is the best. Also, texture or sharpness, if you've got that on your camera, then go to that and put that also on the lowest setting, because action cameras tend to over sharpen everything and make it look really like grainy and just a bit weird. So you just turn that all the way down, makes it look a bit softer, a little bit more professional, a little bit cleaner, and actually makes it look a little bit more high quality. The last thing, this is very dependent on what camera you've got, and that is wide lenses. The The wider you go, the faster it's going to look, the better it's going to look, because you're going to be able to see your handlebars, see where you are. It's going to warp the edges, make it that motion come around the corner as the person's watching it. The wider you go, the faster it looks. And obviously that can get you into some issues because people think you're absolutely flying through the streets when you're not. So it's going to make you look a lot faster than you're actually going. So that is obviously an issue you need to keep an eye on, and put a disclaimer on maybe at the front of your videos. I'm going to start doing that to say that you're in a wide field of view with 24 frames per second at 1/50th. So the motion is going to be very unrealistic to what you're actually going. If you zoom in on this footage, you can see this looks really slow. But if I zoom out on that same piece of footage, now we look like we're going a lot faster. Do you know what I mean? The wider you go, the faster it looks. If you've got a wide lens, whack it on, get it all the way out. It looks so much better. That's it. Audio, I just use a plugged in Rode mic from the camera into my helmet. Bosh, job done, goes straight into here. There's no fancy bits with that. Obviously I add some colours and stuff in on here, but I'll do a separate video on that about exactly what I do to my footage to make it look the way it does. But yeah, that's how you set up your camera and how you change your footage from this to this. It's really not that difficult. Anyone can do it. You don't have to be a professional. You just have to know how to use those 3 things that I've just showed you. So definitely go do a couple of test runs, because you will probably make a couple of mistakes, but just go see what you can do. Get an ND filter. All my stuff's linked below. So if you do want the best camera on the market with all the best settings and the ND filters, you'll find it all below, along with my mic and my Instagram and all that sort of stuff. All right, so yeah, shout out to you guys. Thanks for watching the video. Hopefully I've helped you out. Go upgrade your footage, and yeah, tag me in your videos. I'll have a look. See you later.